I want to talk about F. Scott Fitzgerald, a great American novelist. Most of you have probably read The Great Gatsby in high school. What we're going to look at today is the first novel that he produced, This Side of Paradise. It's highly autobiographical. It's about his days at Princeton and shortly thereafter. And it is a very personal sort of book. It's something that people tend to either love or hate. I think a lot of young people love this book because it really does capture something about what it is to be a college student, to be young and grappling with a variety of problems in life, trying to come up with your own ideas, trying to deal with all sorts of pressures on you and so forth. Some people dislike the main character, Amory Blaine, who stands in for Fitzgerald himself, but a lot of people like him and identify with him, and so it's a work that is now considered somewhat immature in his oeuvre, but nevertheless, it's something that I think gives you a real insight into how Fitzgerald thinks about the world. F. Scott Fitzgerald himself was an amazingly significant figure during his life. He was somebody who reshaped American literature, who gave expression, in a sense, to the attitude of America in the Roaring '20s. As you can see, he died young. He was only 44. And in the 1920s, when he was publishing this work, for example, he was still in his 20s. So this is the work of a young man. But it's also something that shows you what a remarkable figure he was. That even in his 20s, he was being talked about, he was being written about. He was considered, overnight, really, one of the major American novelists. Early success spoils a lot of people. And you might argue that it actually made his life more difficult than it might otherwise have been. Very rapid success creates a lot of personal problems for people. Think about basically anybody who's ever been a star on the Disney Channel. He wasn't quite that young, but nevertheless, that sort of burst of success can be personally destructive. He did have an amazing series of novels. This Side of Paradise came out in 1920 when he was only 24. The Beautiful and the Damned, 2 years later. Then The Great Gatsby, 3 years after that. Keep in mind, at this point, he was still only 29 years old. Tender is the Night, then in 1934. The Last Tycoon in 1941. By the last decade of his life, he was working some on novels, but mostly he was in Hollywood as a screenwriter. And so he also wrote the screenplays, or was involved in writing the screenplays for a number of different movies of that era. The appeal of Hollywood was too strong. The fame, the money, the exposure, it was something he loved. He liked being in the limelight. That isn't necessarily great for literary productivity. And so most people think that it was really with The Great Gatsby that he hit his highest point, and that after age 29 it was sort of all downhill from there. Still, downhill from there is still really high up there. It's something like once you've been to the peaks of Everest, you might be coming down, but you're still really at high altitudes. And so I don't want to say that his later work is not good. It's excellent. It's just, most of us would be thrilled to ever write something as good as that. But he was somebody who peaked very young. Here you see a cafe in Paris, the F. Scott Fitzgerald Cafe, dedicated to him. And so he remains a symbol of the jazz age, of the Roaring '20s, of a certain attitude of American self-confidence. Here he is pictured on the Saturday Evening Post, which shows you something incredible. By the way, that is May 1st, 1920. That was upon the publication of This Side of Paradise. Imagine being 24 years old, your first novel comes out, and suddenly you're on the cover of what was then America's largest circulation magazine. It was just instant, overnight fame. It's as if you were here as a UT student. You think, hey, maybe I'll write a novel. You do, you send it off to some publisher, all of a sudden it's published and you're world famous at 24. That's an amazing thing, and this novel had that effect. Now, it is a coming-of-age novel. This Side of Paradise is a work that is describing his student days at Princeton, then his leaving Princeton to go off to war, his attempts at romance, then his return to Princeton. Really, you might say, not a lot happens in this novel. The reason I don't have you read the whole thing is that I think you'd be impatient, because for about 100 pages, more or less all that happens is that he sits around his dorm room at Princeton and talks to people about stuff. And you might think, you know, in some sense, it's interesting to sit around in college and talk to people, but you don't necessarily want to hear 100 pages of somebody else's conversations. And so you might argue that, look, not a lot happens. But from another point of view, a lot does happen. Because actually, even though it's not really action that is represented in the novel most of the time, a lot of things occur. His mother dies, for example. His mentor, Monsignor Darcy, dies. Several friends die. One disappears. Some go off to war and never return, but others just vanish. And then, well, the girl he loves dumps him to marry a rich man she doesn't love because she thinks he's an aspiring writer who's never going to make any money. This was indeed autobiographical. He was in love from a very young age with Zelda, and Zelda did dump him to marry a rich man because she thought, he's a writer, he'll never amount to anything, I'm not going to sign up for a life of poverty. But then he published This Side of Paradise, he was suddenly famous, and so she dropped the rich guy and married him anyway. So, yeah, I mean, Fitzgerald did not have the greatest taste in women. I mean, you'd think, wait a minute, but he was utterly out of breath. Like, yay, you know, yes, I got the girl of my dreams, and it didn't bother him that she was willing to dump him when he was poor, but suddenly married him as soon as he got famous and wealthy. In any case, he then dates another girl who turns out to be crazy, and in one of the one really dramatic scene in the novel, they go on horseback riding, and she starts riding her horse toward a cliff, and is in effect playing a game of chicken, racing the horse toward the cliff. And poor Amory Blaine is there on horseback, and for a while he's trying to gallop his horse alongside hers, and then he starts realizing they're heading for the cliff. Oh my God, what's going on? And she is just screaming with laughter, as at the last moment she leaps off the horse, and the horse goes and plunges off the cliff to its death. And, well, I talked about taste in women. I mean, at least Amory Blaine does not go out with her again after that episode. But in any case, yeah, there are all sorts of strange happenings here. He does, even though most of the action isn't represented in the novel itself, a lot of things happen to Amory to shape him. He goes off to Princeton, a self-confident young man, somebody who is impressed with himself, impressed with his own mind, impressed with the people around him, and then various things shake him and affect his own self-confidence, affect his sense of mooring, his sense of identity. Well, Fitzgerald wrote to the publisher that his title came from some lines from Rupert Brooks, a poet who wrote this. Well, this side of paradise, there's little comfort in the wise. Which I suppose is another way of saying wisdom really doesn't do you much good in this world. And there is another epigraph from Oscar Wilde. Experience is the name so many people give to their mistakes. So already by age 24, F. Scott Fitzgerald is looking back on his life at this time, saying, I've made a lot of mistakes. I've done a lot of stupid things. Even when I've tried to be wise and I've hung out with people who sought wisdom, I've got to admit it's done me very little good. So part of what makes this, I think, a really interesting, and in a way a great coming-of-age novel, is that he's writing it when he's still young, but already with this sense of disillusionment, already with this sense that, look, he's made a lot of mistakes, he's done a lot of things wrong, he's been foolish, even when he thought he was being wise, it hasn't worked out very well, it hasn't done him much good. And so there is this very worldly, oh my gosh, an attitude you might expect to come from much greater age looking back. To think he's often looking back at something that happened 2 years before to him is sort of remarkable. It feels like there's a much greater distance and a much greater wisdom reflected in his own attitudes about this. Well, there are a number of themes I want to talk about here. There are a lot of things that get brought up in the course of the novel. As he's talking to his roommates, as he's talking to the Monsignor, as he's talking to the character who is the representative of Zelda, and so on. And he faces a number of crucial issues. Now, before we get into the details of the issues that he faces, I want to ask you what issues you would expect a college student to face. I realize you're only a month into this, and so you might think, look, I can't tell you. So far my issues have been mostly like, wait, where is that class? Where's that building? You know, what? I'm supposed to go to this lecture series? What are you talking about? I have to write a paper? And so, I don't mean those issues, but I want you to anticipate a moment, right? Look forward a few years and think, what kinds of big issues do I think I have to confront over the next few years? What are the things that I'm going to have to make up my mind about, or at least hope that I'll be making up my mind about? Yeah?
Figuring out like what you want to spend the rest of your life doing.
Good, figuring out what you want to spend the rest of your life doing. That's a really important thing. You're going to have to think, what do I really love? What do I want to spend lots of time doing? And a lot of students come here thinking they want to do something or other, then they do it for a couple of years and they think, oh, that's been 2 years. Can I imagine doing this for the next 20 years or 30 years? And they think, I can change majors. And that's a common thing, that's a normal thing. So in a way it is a chance to find out what you really want to spend many years of your life doing. Yeah. Okay, good, finding a sense of purpose. That's partly connected to a career, but not entirely connected to a career. It's partly a matter of finding a purpose in your life. Up until this point, a lot of people feel as if their purpose has been more or less given to them. You know, their parents, their teachers have told them what to do. Now, all of a sudden, they have a chance to figure out for themselves what they want to do with their life, and that's partly a matter of career and things like that, but it's partly a matter of what is the purpose I'm going to assign to my life? And that's a hard question. You really have to decide what you want to do with your life, and not just in material terms, like what kind of job do I want? Really, what are my goals in? What are some other things you might expect to have to figure out? Yeah?
Your spirituality and your beliefs.
Good, beliefs, including spiritual beliefs. Some of those will be beliefs about God, about religion, about sort of philosophy of life, big type questions. Some of them might be political questions. A lot of people come of age politically in their 20s, and so you'll form a lot of attitudes that will stay with you for a long time about a lot of things. Some of them will be tastes in music or in literature or other things you just enjoy spending your time doing. A lot of aspects of your personality will form around this time. And so there will be big questions about whether you believe in God, about what kind of person you are, what kind of things you like to do, what your vision of an ideal society is. All of those things are things that you might expect to crystallize over the next few years. What are some other things? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Erik Erikson, a psychologist, charted 8 different stages of life. And at this point, you're in the midst of a stage. Actually, 2 stages, really. One of them is a stage about identity, forming an identity and a sense of who you really are and what your purpose is, what your goals are. And one of them is a question of intimacy versus isolation, as he put it. A question of how you're going to relate to other people. Some of this has to do with love, and whether you're going to find love, and what you want in a sort of loving relationship. Some of it has to do with introversion versus extroversion. To what extent do you want to be around other people? To what extent do you need other people? And what kind of role do you want to have other people play in your life? So those questions of, to what extent are you a loner? To what extent do you want to be, in the midst of other people? And especially, what kind of person do you want to fall in love with? Do you want to get married? If so, what kind of person do you want to get married to? And maybe you actually find that person. Whatever. So these are things that are, you might say, all connected together. These questions about identity, about purposes, about love, those are all things that you have to sort out. And indeed, Amory, although he doesn't talk about them directly very much, is concerned with all of those things. That last chapter I asked you to read is him trying out various aspects of identity in politics and other things. But we see it throughout other parts of the novel, with love, with his own attitudes about ideas, what he thinks his own role is. He thinks, gee, should I be a professor? Should I be a businessman? Should I be this? Should I be that? He's playing with these ideas of different careers. And so there is a huge amount of identity forming and figuring out who he is, what he wants to do, what his goals in life are. Are there other things that you think would be important to figure out during these next few years of your life? Well, those are the most important ones, sure. And now, how does that change in a particular setting? For example, here, he is writing this novel just in the period just leading up to 1920. And so what is the major event of his college years? The First World War, okay? People being called up to war. So a lot of those things that we just mentioned, thinking about identity, about love, about goals, about careers, all of those things can suddenly take a different turn. In his case, he has to leave Princeton partway through to go to the war. Okay, he gets drafted. And a number of his friends do too. There are other things, though, that might happen. Actually, my own dissertation director, Wilfred Sellers, never got a PhD. Why not? Because he was in graduate school at Oxford when World War II broke out. And he ended up working for the Naval Office and so on, and his graduate studies got interrupted. They never got finished. And there were a number of people of that era who were in grad school and never finished because of the war. Some of them, that meant they got out of academia, but others like him got hired as professors anyway, even though they never finished their degrees. And so things like that, events from the outside can interrupt all of this. And in a part, this book is about those things that are pretty universal for a young person, figuring out identity and career and love and all sorts of things, but partly they're about that interruption, what that does. And here he is facing the question about war. Somebody that he's talking to is going to volunteer. Somebody else is a pacifist and says, no, I think war is immoral. I don't know who's right and who's wrong in this war, but even if I knew, I wouldn't think it's right to fight. Because even if other people are using violence, I think it's wrong to respond with violence. Violence is never justified. And Amory Blaine is trying to figure out how he feels about this. So he's confronting a question about war that can arise whenever there's something large like this. It was significant in World War I. Remember, 117,000 American soldiers died in the First World War, even though we were only involved for about a year and a half. But World War II was many times that number and a much greater disruption of people's lives. And then later we'll talk about the Vietnam era. And so this kind of thing can happen. Those kinds of events can change people's lives dramatically. Anyway, he's thinking about the issue this confronts him with suddenly. He hasn't been thinking about this at all. He's been thinking about those other big questions. All of a sudden, it's to fight or not to fight. That's not a question he had expected to be able to think about or to have to think about. But suddenly he says, I get to the end of all the logic about non-resistance. And there, like an excluded middle, stands the huge specter of man as he is and always will be. Now, what on earth does this mean? He's thinking about the question of whether it's ever legitimate to fight, to use violence, in self-defense or in defense of your country. And he's looking at these arguments that one of his friends is putting out about how it's wrong to fight. Violence is always wrong. You've always got to treat other people with dignity, blah, 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 blah. And he looks at that and he says, well, all right, I follow the argument, and then I hit this point. He says, like an excluded middle. Does anybody know what that's in reference to? There is in logic something called the law of excluded middle. And what it means is basically this. P or not P, for any proposition P. Okay? Either this or not that. There is no other thing in between. So, are you willing to fight? Yes or no. There is no in between. Similarly, you might say, but now notice here, what stands in between like an excluded middle is the huge specter of man. He confronts human nature. In other words, he says, look, at some point, the law of excluded middle says you have to choose. Do you want, what? Somebody says, you're ordering this dish, and they say, do you want queso on top of it? The answer is yes or no. You can't say, well, kind of. Right? You have to decide. Now, there are lots of questions you don't actually have to decide. You're not faced with that excluded middle choice. I can say, what is your opinion of Beethoven's later string quartets? And you don't have to give me an answer. You can say, I don't know. Who's Beethoven? You mean like the dog from the movie? Or you could say, actually, I think they're wonderful. Or you could think, gosh, actually I'm a fan of the earlier Beethoven, or he's the guy who did dun 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 dun, right? Whatever your response is, you don't really have to commit yourself. And there are all sorts of questions on which you don't have to commit yourself. I'm a philosopher, and sometimes people will ask me questions. And I just say, I don't have a view about that. I really don't know. I don't have a position about that issue. And on lots of issues, that's fine. But all of a sudden, war breaks out, and you can't say, I don't have a position. All of a sudden, let's say you're drafted, and now, all right, you have to either report or claim conscientious objector status, and you have to commit. You can't say, well, it's an interesting philosophical question. I don't know. You actually have to commit. And so, in part, he's thinking about situations like that require a decision. Either it's this way or it's not that way, and you actually have to commit yourself. Now, a lot of philosophers, are happy to affirm excluded middle, but not choose either kind of thing. Are the later string quartets great? For example, if that refer to a musical question, you could say, well, either they are or they aren't. And I'm not forced to commit, But already that example actually tells you there are situations, even apart from decision, that aren't like this. There are things that are in between. Am I tall? Do I say either I'm tall or I'm not tall? Well, you might think I'm kind of tall. I'm sort of tall, I'm kind of borderline. Or, I'll tell you my favorite story like this. It's a ridiculous story. But then again, I was a grad student in philosophy, and that's sort of a ridiculous position in life. But anyway, we had a philosophy department softball team when I was at the University of Pittsburgh. And we played teams from the business school and the engineering school and so on and so forth. We always lost. We just always lost. And what we would do afterwards is go to a bar and drink a beer and blame each other for losing. And so this happened week after week, We would lose and we'd go to the bar and somebody would say, it was usually my fault. It was all your fault. If you had caught that ball at third base and tagged the guy out, then hey, we would have won the game. I said, well, if only you had thrown the ball so that I could actually reach it without having to get off the base. And then somebody else would say, well, if you had only got a hit and we had the bases loaded and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I digress. We did, by the way, later win a game. And we got to the bar and just sat there morosely over our beers. For like 20 minutes, nobody said a word. Finally, somebody said, why is nobody saying anything? And we all realized it's because we had nobody to blame. We won. We didn't know what to do. But anyway, here's how we lost to the business school. They're at bat. Pitch comes in. Guy hits this long ball to right field. Now we're playing on these intramural fields that actually don't have foul lines marked. It goes all the way down there and hits a light post. Is the light post in fair territory or foul territory? Well, it isn't marked, and it's kind of borderline, so we're not sure. So of course the business school people are saying, it's fair, it's a fair ball. We're saying, no, it's a foul ball. Well, if it's a fair ball, it's a home run. The guy who circles the bases. But if it's a foul ball, it's a strike. And so there's a big argument. Finally, somebody from the business school proposes a compromise. Let's just call it a ground rule double. And so most of us say, yeah, that's fair, ground rule double. Then, our pitcher suddenly says, wait, that makes no sense. Either it was fair or it was not fair. There's the law of excluded middle. If it's fair, it's a home run. If it's not fair, it's a strike. So the business school says this, well, then it's a home run, yay! We win the game. So, the law of excluded middle cost us that softball game. See, I'm still blaming things. But now, what's the point here? It's more specific than that. It's the huge specter of man, as he is and always will be. And so we think, wait, it's not just, I have to choose, I have to commit. Either it's okay to fight or it's not. He's now got to say, there's something about human nature that is fundamental. And I have to decide that question of human nature. He says this specter stands right beside the one logical necessity of Tolstoy's and the other logical necessity of Nietzsche's. Now for Tolstoy here, for our purposes, we can think of Dostoevsky. Because for the contrast he has in mind, I think they played the same role. It's the same contrast. Tolstoy versus Nietzsche, Dostoevsky versus Nietzsche. Now, what is that contrast? This is something that we talked about for a week, right? We read Nietzsche, we read Dostoevsky. What is this contrast, this excluded middle he has in mind? He's basically saying either the world is this way or it's this way. And so, in a sense, when he's thinking about this question, to fight or not to fight, he realizes there's a more basic question. A question about human nature, and a question that is basically Dostoevsky versus Nietzsche. Is it this way or is it this way? Now, how would you characterize that contrast? What is the difference? What's the distinction? What is this tension or this choice that he thinks you have to make? Yeah?
Is it about free will?
All right, there are a number of aspects of it. One way of looking at it is indeed free will. Am I really free, or am I driven by my biochemistry? Right? In Nietzsche, we've got this image that all my thoughts, all my feelings, all my intentions and desires, all of my goals and ideals really reduce to these basic, lowly materials. In the end, they're all a question of my brain biochemistry. And so, in the final analysis, none of that comes to anything. I don't really have much of any freedom. I am driven by the laws governing the scientific image. In Dostoevsky, on the other hand, I do have a fundamental choice. And so I do have freedom. So one part of this contrast is, look, do I even have any freedom to decide this issue? Is this something that I actually have a choice about or not? But of course, suppose I do have a choice. There's still a choice posed by Dostoevsky versus Nietzsche. So there are other aspects of that contrast too. How should I think about something? Yeah?
Is it Dostoevsky or Tolstoy?
Well, for our purposes, they're the same. I mean, they're not the same. Look, that's silly from one point of view, but I think he has in mind the same philosophical contrast. So, Tolstoy versus Nietzsche. What's the contrast he's really thinking? Yeah?
Indifferent equality versus some people are higher.
Okay. This vision of equality versus some people being higher. So one way of thinking about this is to think about Dostoevsky's story within a story. Think about the Grand Inquisitor and this idea that Ivan has, that some people ought to be the shepherds, other people ought to be the sheep. As opposed to the more mature Dostoevskys deploring that idea. Ilyusha, hearing this story, still loves Ivan, but nevertheless is not impressed with this at all. Thinks this is a terrible vision of society. So indeed, that's one question. Whether not just I actually have free will, but whether we, you might say, as a group, have the kind of freedom to explore and develop our own destiny, or whether we are needing to be led by some small group of leaders. So that would be another way of looking at this. That would be a question of, do I defer to the leaders, or do I make up my own mind? I think there are other aspects to this contrast too. Do you see others? Yeah?
Nietzsche doesn't have any like off-limits where it does limitize and morality.
Okay, yes. Dostoevsky gives you a moral vision. In the end, to discard that morality is a very, very dangerous thing to do. Whereas, actually, Nietzsche would agree with that, but he thinks it's inevitable. He thinks the old morality is gone. God is dead. Absolutes are dead. Absolute truth is dead. Morality is dead. And so that does put us in a very dangerous place, but now it's up to us to redefine things. Whereas in Dostoevsky's story, Ivan's the one who's basically saying, yeah, it's up to me to redefine things, leaving at the end. And that is not something Dostoevsky in the end endorses. So one way of looking at this is there a moral code that governs me from the outside? Is there something I am beholden to that is the source of authority that is larger than me, that is part of a moral system that governs me from the outside, as it were? Or is morality in the way I choose to live something that's purely to be developed from the inside, something that I choose, which is Nietzsche's vision of revaluing values, becoming the person I am. And so Nietzsche will say, look, it's up to me to become the person I am. And Dostoevsky or Tolstoy would say, no, there is a moral code outside of you. There are some rules about how to live that are independent of you, that aren't up to you, that govern what you want to do. Other aspects of this choice between Tolstoy or Dostoevsky on the one hand and Nietzsche on the other. I'm sorry? Somebody said something I thought was wise, but might have been just a stray. Well, anyway, remember the way Dostoevsky puts it, this contrast between, you might say, being about something larger than myself or being about me. It's closely related to that last thing we mentioned. Am I the ultimate source of authority? Am I the ultimate source of norms for myself? Or is there something outside of me that gives me those norms? Is there something larger than me that I have to be answerable to? Well, in any event, that brings us to the question of morality and the question of good and evil, right and wrong, what you ought to do and what you ought not to do. And here, Amory has some interesting things to say. He says, if we could only learn to look on evil as evil, whether it's clothed in filth or monotony or magnificence.
It seems like every single philosopher always covers morality at some point in their life.
She says, it seems like every philosopher talks about morality at some point. It's like, you know, as soon as somebody starts doing philosophy, eventually they're going to tell you what to do. And actually, that's mostly true. It's not entirely true. There are the skeptics who say, look, you can't know anything, and that means I can't know anything about morality, and neither do you, so I can't tell you how to live. And you don't know how to live because nobody knows how to live, so just don't worry about it. But you're right, most non-skeptical philosophers end up having something to say about this question of how to live. Now here, notice he's saying, let's look at evil as evil, no matter how it's clothed. We might find it clothed in filth. We might find it clothed in monotony. We might find it clothed in magnificence. It is independent, in other words, of a lot of external markers. So, do not think that a poor person is necessarily morally inferior, but neither should you think that a poor person automatically has a kind of moral authority just by being poor. It's independent of all that. It's independent of what kind of job you have, whether your life is boring or interesting. It's independent of whether you are, in Aristotelian terms, magnificent and have good taste and so on and so forth, or whether you're not. Being wealthy and having good taste does not make you a good moral person. Neither does it make you a bad moral person. It's just independent of all. Now, he's thinking about leaving for war. And he says, what we leave here is more than this class. It's the whole heritage of youth. We're just one generation. We're breaking all the links that seem to bind us here. Notice he's writing, well, he's of course writing this after having gone to war, but he's representing Amory as thinking this before he even goes. There's an attitude here that we've seen in Remarque, for example, in All Quiet on the Western Front. This idea that somehow you go away, and in a certain sense you can never come back. You're changed by the experience. You come back a different person. You can't re-enter the world and occupy the place you had before. You've changed the world. The way the world feels to you has changed. You no longer fit into it the way you did before. And he's aware of that. He knows when he's leaving, it's all going to change. That some people are coming back, some people aren't coming back. That they'll come back changed. That nothing is going to be as it was. And so here he makes a reference to Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher, who said famously, you can't put your foot into the same river twice. Why? Because things are constantly changing. And it's a different river every time, different water. And so, he says, here, Heraclitus, did you find in fire and shifting things. The prophecy you hurled down the dead years. This midnight, my desire will see, shadowed among the embers, furled in flame, the splendor, and the sadness of the world. So, essentially what's happening here is that people are building a bonfire on campus the last night they're there before going off to war. And he's looking at this, walking around campus, seeing it in the evening, some of the lights, seeing this bonfire, and seeing the splendor and the sadness of the world reflected in this. The splendor, the beauty of the place. And I don't know if you've been on the campus of Princeton University. It is gorgeous. It's absolutely beautiful. And also, then, the sadness of leaving it, the sadness of going off to war, of knowing that the person he has been is not coming back, even if he lives through this, that he will be fundamentally changed. Well, in the final chapter, we get this discussion of the loss of faith, of the people he describes as the heirs of progress. This is him and his entire generation. The New York Times described Fitzgerald as having defined a generation. And he does this in 1920 through the publication of this novel. People immediately recognize him as the voice of an entire generation. The heirs of progress. Oh, there he is with Zelda, by the way. Dressed in 1920s style.
So fashionable.
I know, quite something. Anyway, there's this inner dialogue he reports, describing his own moral drift. And so we come back to the question of morality. But I want you to notice here the loss of faith, the confusion, the uncertainty. Here's the question, where are you drifting? Don't ask me. Don't you care? Rather, I don't want to commit moral suicide. Have you no interests left? None. I've no more virtue to lose. Just as a cooling pot gives off heat, so all through youth and adolescence we give off calories of virtue. That's what's called ingenuousness. Are you corrupt? I think so. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about good and evil at all anymore. So he's basically saying, look, all of youth, all of adolescence, I feel as if I've been giving off these calories of virtue. I've been like a hot pot cooling off, okay? I was given all of this moral teaching by my parents, by my teachers, by my Monsignor, by my church, and so on. And I've been losing them bit by bit, okay? Sometimes through doing unwise things, sometimes through doing things I thought were wise and didn't work out. But in any case, by now, he feels as if, number one, he doesn't know. He is becoming sort of a skeptic. He feels like, I don't know good and evil anymore. I don't know what to do. I don't know what's what. I feel completely confused. Am I corrupt? Well, I think so. I feel as if I've lost that virtue, that sense of innocence, that sense of right and wrong that I used to have. I'm not sure about good and evil at all anymore. I don't know. Now, this is a great line. I don't want to repeat my innocence. It's not that he wants to go back to that earlier state. I want the pleasure of losing it again. This reminds me of St. Augustine's prayer. Lord, give me abstinence and continence, but not yet. Okay, it's a bit like, yeah, look, I've lost my innocence. I don't really want to go back to being innocent. I just like the pleasure of losing it again. Now, he feels as if he has lost something, as if he did have a sense of good and evil, right and wrong, and he's lost it. He had a sense of virtue and he's lost it. And he doesn't want to go back. He values the experiences through which he's lost it, and yet keep in mind that motto. Experience is the name people give to their mistakes. And so really he recognizes that it's been through a series of mistakes and corruption that he's done. Well, earlier in the novel, he gets through this by having heroes, by having people he looks up to, by having his mother there, who is a kind of moral core, by having Monsignor, who is a wise older person who can serve as a mentor and give him guidance. But by this point in the novel, he feels as if he's got nobody left. Nobody who's wise, nobody to look up to, nobody to trust. He says there were no more wise men, there were no more heroes. Burn Holloway was sunk from sight as though he had never lived. That's his friend who disappears. Monsignor was dead. Amory had grown up to 1,000 books, 1,000 lies. He had listened eagerly to people who pretended to know who knew nothing. So suddenly he finds himself looking around campus, looking at all the people in his life, there in Princeton or elsewhere, saying, who's left who I actually trust, to know virtue, to know the difference between good and evil, right and wrong? Who's there that I can look up to as a role model, to say, try to be like that person? He says, nobody. Life was a damned muddle. A football game, with everyone offside and the referee gotten rid of. Everyone claiming the referee would have been on his side. That's why I told you the story about the softball game. Not football, but still rather like that. No umpire. Everybody claiming the umpire would have been on his side, and so on. It's a damn muddle. It looks like it's unclear what the rules are, and moreover, when you try to play by the rules, nobody's there to judge who's right and wrong. There's nobody to trust. Everybody's claiming they're doing the right thing. Now there's this weird passage about the romantic elf. And I gotta admit, I'm not entirely certain how to interpret this. He says he found something that he wanted. That he had always wanted, and always would want. Not to be admired as he had feared. Not to be loved as he had made himself believe. but to be necessary to people, to be indispensable. So he's thinking about himself, and at some point in the novel, he really does fear. He just wants to be admired. He's just interested in getting the esteem of other people, whether he deserves it or not. Then he thinks, well, really, I want to be loved. But now he's thinking, I want to be needed. And at that point, he feels as if he understands something about himself. Life opened up in one of its amazing bursts of radiance, and Amory suddenly and permanently rejected a little epigram that had been playing listlessly in his mind. Very few things matter, and nothing matters very much. On the contrary, Amory felt an immense desire to give people a sense of security. I've labeled that Epiphany because James Joyce had earlier, about a decade earlier, popularized this idea in his writing. His characters often, at a crucial moment in the story, have an epiphany. This sudden realization, this sudden recognition of some truth that transforms their lives. And that's what happens here to Amory Blade. He has this epiphany. He suddenly thinks, yes, wait a minute, I've been telling myself nothing matters. I've been responding to my own moral confusion, my own lack of certainty, my own lack of direction, by saying, none of it matters, none of it matters very much if it does. And all of a sudden he says, no, it does matter. And it's not just a question of wanting to be liked or even loved. It's a matter of serving people, giving people security. It's a matter of helping others. And so here he says there are two kinds of people. Here's another excluded middle. Because once you decide this, once you decide, yes, I want to make the world a better place, I want to be needed, I want to contribute to the welfare of other people, what do you do about human nature? That excluded middle of human nature as you confront it. Do you take people as they are? Or do you try in some way to transform people? Some people are, he calls it spiritually married. That is to say, they think human nature is a given. There's nothing much you can do about it. You take it as you find it, and you adapt morality and life and politics and everything else around it. Others seek new systems that are going to transform or at least counteract it, are going to try to find systems that will actually make people different people. We've seen, I suppose you could say, Locke, Dostoevsky, who else? Doyle, a number of people taking human nature as they found it, and then other people like Rousseau and Marx and Shaw, I suppose you could say, saying, no, I want to actually come up with a system that will transform human beings. I'm not taking human nature for granted. It's something that's the result of something else. So he says, there is a basic divide. And now we get one of those beautiful passages that's so characteristic of Fitzgerald's writing. In fact, this reminds me very much of the ending of The Great Gatsby. As an endless dream that went on, the spirit of the past brooding over a new generation, the chosen youth from the muddled, unchastened world, still fed romantically on the mistakes and half-forgotten dreams of dead statesmen and poets. Here was a new generation, shouting the old cries, learning the old creed, through a reverie of long days and nights, destined finally to go out into that dirty gray turmoil, to follow love and pride. A new generation dedicated. Sorry, I still have the remnant of a cold. Yeah, I think everybody does. A new generation dedicated more than the last to the fear of poverty and the worship of success, grown up to find all gods dead, all wars fought, all faiths in man shaken. There was no God in his heart, he knew. So here he is, Dostoevsky versus Nietzsche. He's choosing Nietzsche, notice. All gods dead. His ideas were still in riot. There was ever the pain of memory, the regret for his lost youth. Yet the waters of disillusion had left a deposit on his soul. Responsibility and a love of life, a faint stirring of old ambitions and unrealized dreams. And finally, the novel ends with these words, which should remind you of Nietzsche's idea that you should become the person you are. I know myself, he cried, but that is all.